The courtroom was a place of cold formality, yet it felt more suffocating than ever that afternoon. Judge Samuel Harrington, a man known for his stern demeanor and conservative views, adjusted his glasses as he scanned the courtroom with an air of indifference. His deep-set eyes were a sharp contrast to the otherwise calm atmosphere that hung in the air. On the other side of the room sat the defendant, Amara Williams, a 34-year-old black woman who had been accused of a crime she vehemently denied committing. Her lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Claire Johnson, had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Amara's heart pounded as she sat, her back straight and hands folded in her lap. She'd never been in a courtroom before, let alone facing a judge as intimidating as Judge Harrington. He had a reputation for being harsh, especially when it came to cases involving people of color. Amara had heard whispers about the man, rumors that painted him as someone with a biased mindset, a judge who favored one race over another. But this was her reality now. She couldn't afford to be intimidated. "Ms. Williams," Judge Harrington began, his voice deep and commanding, "you stand accused of assaulting Officer Thomas, an officer of the law. How do you plead?" The words hung in the air, an accusation that threatened to crush her under its weight. Amara took a deep breath, maintaining eye contact with the judge. She was determined not to let fear dictate her actions. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the nerve that threatened to overwhelm her. There was a shift in the room as the judge's lips curled into a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. "We shall see about that," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Amara to hear. His tone was laced with something darker, something unsettling. Her lawyer, Claire, shot him a glance, but said nothing. She knew well that challenging the judge's subtle bias in court would only make things worse. But as the trial proceeded, it became clear that the judge wasn't going to make this easy for Amara. The prosecution painted a damning picture. They claimed that Amara had assaulted Officer Thomas during a routine traffic stop, an incident that escalated when she allegedly refused to show her ID. The prosecutor's words were calculated, and their version of events seemed designed to paint Amara as the aggressor, a woman who had lashed out in a fit of rage, attacking a respected officer of the law. Amara knew the truth, but no one in that courtroom seemed to care about the facts. The officer, Thomas, stood confidently on the witness stand, his expression cold as he described the events. Amara's chest tightened with frustration as she listened to his version, which was riddled with inconsistencies and exaggerations. She could see the judge's reaction as Thomas spoke. Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly, nodding in approval with every word that painted Amara as a danger. It was as if the judge had already made up his mind, and no amount of truth or evidence could change that. As the day wore on, the tension in the room grew thick, almost unbearable. Amara's heart sank as the prosecutor finished his closing statement, confident in his victory. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. Claire, Amara's lawyer, was not about to let the truth be buried without a fight. Claire stood up, her voice calm but forceful. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, addressing the room. "What we have here is a case of mistaken identity. Amara Williams was not the aggressor. She was the one who was wrongfully detained and harassed. Officer Thomas has exaggerated the events, and his testimony is nothing more than a reflection of his own biases." The courtroom fell silent as Claire's words hung in the air. Amara felt a flicker of hope, but the judge's expression didn't change. In fact, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing what could only be described as disdain. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his voice colder now than ever before. "I'm afraid, Ms. Johnson, that your argument is unconvincing. We have a duty to uphold the law, and the facts as presented are damning. This trial will proceed, and we will see how it unfolds." Amara's heart sank even further as the judge banged his gavel. The decision had already been made in his mind. The trial was not about the truth. It was about the power he wielded over the lives of those who stood before him. And Amara, a black woman in a courtroom filled with prejudice, had little chance of winning. But deep within her, something stirred. This wasn't the end. She wasn't going to let this man, this judge, destroy her without a fight. She had something he didn't know about, something that would turn everything upside down. Amara looked at Claire, their eyes locking in silent understanding. They both knew this battle was far from over. And what would come next would leave the judge and everyone else in that courtroom stunned. The days following the first hearing felt like an eternity. Amara spent sleepless nights replaying the events of that day, hoping for a miracle, something to shift the tide in her favor. But the truth was undeniable. The odds were stacked against her. Every time she walked into that courtroom, Judge Harrington's icy stare felt like a weight on her chest. The whispers around the courthouse, the murmurs about his reputation, the bias that seemed to linger in the very air, everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion. This was not going to be a fair trial. Still, Amara refused to give in to despair. She had to keep fighting. She had to believe that there was a way to expose the truth. But what was the truth? Could she truly convince the jury that Officer Thomas had fabricated the entire story? Or was she just another victim of a system designed to silence her? One afternoon, as Claire was reviewing the case files in her office, she received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar but strained. It was Detective Angela Monroe, a seasoned investigator with the local police department. "Claire," Angela's voice crackled over the line. "I got something you need to see. It's about Officer Thomas." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Angela was known for her professionalism, but she also had a reputation for digging deeper than anyone else. "What is it?" Claire asked, already grabbing her coat and heading out the door. "It's a video," Angela replied, her tone low and urgent. "I'll meet you at the diner on 5th Street. It's something you'll want to see in person." When Claire arrived at the diner, she found Angela sitting in a corner booth, her expression tense. The detective slid a tablet across the table, the screen displaying a grainy video. "Watch it," Angela urged, her eyes scanning the room nervously. Claire clicked play, her breath catching in her throat as the video began. It showed Officer Thomas at a bar late one night, clearly intoxicated, engaging in a heated conversation with a group of men. His words were slurred, but one thing was unmistakable. He was talking about Amara. "Yeah, I'm gonna nail that expletive," Thomas slurred, laughing as he took another swig from his bottle. "She won't know what hit her. I've got her cornered, and that be asterisk, 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 asterisk is going down." The video played on, revealing more of Thomas's anger and deep-seated racism. It was clear from his words that he had targeted Amara long before that traffic stop. His hatred, his bias, it all bled through in his drunken rant. Claire's hands shook as she replayed the clip, her mind racing. This was it. This was the proof they needed. But what did this mean for the trial? Could they use this in court? Would the judge, especially one like Judge Harrington, even allow it? "I'll take care of this," Angela said quietly, her eyes locked on Claire's. "But you need to be careful. If Harrington gets wind of this, it could backfire. We can't trust anyone in that courtroom." Claire nodded grimly. "We'll handle it carefully. But this changes everything." The following day, the court reconvened, and Amara could feel the tension in the air. The trial was at a crucial point, with both the prosecution and defense having presented their arguments. The jury was deliberating, and the judge's cold demeanor only seemed to grow more oppressive. Amara glanced over at Judge Harrington as he sat on the bench, his face unreadable. He was methodical, almost robotic in his movements, yet there was something unsettling about the way he held his gavel, as if it were an instrument of absolute power. He had made up his mind. Amara was guilty in his eyes. She could see in the way he looked at her, with barely concealed contempt. But then, something unexpected happened. As the defense rested their case, Claire stood up, a file in her hands. The courtroom fell silent as she approached the judge. "Your Honor," Claire began, her voice steady and confident, "I have new evidence that I believe warrants an immediate review of the case." Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow, his gaze narrowing. "I've heard enough, Ms. Johnson. The case is practically closed. You can submit your evidence after the trial, but we don't have time for any more theatrics." But Claire was resolute. "This is not theatrics, Your Honor. This is the truth, and it's vital for the jury to hear it." With that, Claire motioned for a court officer to bring the tablet into the room. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as the officer set it up. Claire clicked play, and within seconds, Officer Thomas's voice filled the room. The video played out in its entirety, revealing the officer's venomous words, his drunken rant, and his blatant racism. The room fell dead silent. Amara's heart raced as she watched the video unfold, feeling a surge of anger and disbelief. How could he have been so careless? How could he have said those things so openly? Judge Harrington's expression shifted, but not in the way Claire had expected. His face grew pale as he watched the video, his jaw tightening. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and for a brief moment, the world felt as though it had come to a halt. When the video ended, Claire waited for the judge's response. He looked up slowly, his face betraying nothing. This video is highly irregular," Harrington muttered, clearly flustered. "You can't just..." But before he could finish, Claire cut him off. "It's admissible evidence, Your Honor, and it's enough to prove Officer Thomas's malice and bias. I believe this calls into question the entire integrity of his testimony." The judge stood up abruptly, his gavel hitting the bench with a loud crack. "This is highly inappropriate. I'll review the matter in chambers. Court is adjourned." As the room erupted into murmurs, Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was it. The truth had been laid bare, and the walls of injustice were starting to crumble. But something told her that the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom was in chaos. The murmurs of the jury, the gasps from spectators, and the sudden explosion of voices among the legal teams filled the space with electric tension. Amara sat frozen, her heart racing as she watched Judge Harrington's expression shift from rigid control to something resembling fear. The moment Claire had presented the video evidence, Amara had expected shock. She had expected outrage. But what she hadn't expected was the look of sheer panic in the judge's eyes. That reaction told her something more was at play, something deeper than just his bias against her. Claire leaned toward Amara, whispering under her breath, "Did you see that? He's not just upset. He's terrified." Amara nodded, her mind racing. What was Judge Harrington hiding? And why did the exposure of Officer Thomas shake him so much? The judge slammed his gavel down, trying to regain order. His voice was sharp, almost desperate. "I will not tolerate disruptions in my courtroom. This matter will be reviewed privately." Claire stood her ground. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this evidence directly impacts the credibility of the prosecution's case. We cannot ignore it." Judge Harrington's fingers tightened around his gavel. "Ms. Johnson, if you continue to undermine my authority, I will hold you in contempt." Amara's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about shutting down the evidence. This was about keeping something buried. Before Claire could respond, a voice in the gallery cut through the tense silence. "Maybe you should recuse yourself, Judge." Everyone turned toward the back of the room. Detective Angela Monroe had entered, standing tall in her crisp suit. In her hands was a folder thick with documents. The bailiff immediately moved toward her, but she held up her badge. "I have official evidence that may be of interest to this court." Judge Harrington's face drained of color. "This is highly improper." Angela didn't wait for permission. She stepped forward, dropping the folder on Claire's desk. "This isn't just about Officer Thomas. This is about the judge himself." Gasps filled the room as Claire opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. Her expression darkened. She looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, do you want to explain why Officer Thomas received an unusually high number of dismissed complaints under your court?" The judge's hands clenched into fists. "That is irrelevant." Angela raised an eyebrow. "I think the legal term is corruption." The tension in the room became unbearable. Judge Harrington's mouth opened, but no words came. Claire continued, flipping through the papers. "This shows a pattern of bias, not just against Amara, but against multiple black defendants. Cases where you ruled in favor of officers with questionable records. Cases where you dismissed key evidence. It's all here." Amara's breath caught in her throat. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just a case of one racist officer targeting her. This was a system that had been upheld and protected by Judge Harrington himself. The judge's massive control was slipping. He stood, gripping the edge of his bench, his voice strained. "This is a mockery of the court. You will all be sanctioned for this." Angela smirked. "Actually, Your Honor, I'd be more concerned about your own sanctions. We've already filed a complaint with the Judicial Board. Your decisions are under review, and given what we just saw, I'd say your time on this bench is running out." The judge's nostrils flared. He looked around the room, as if searching for a way to escape the scrutiny now bearing down on him. His reputation, his power, everything was crumbling. The jury was watching. The gallery was watching. Even the bailiff seemed uncertain about whether to follow his orders. And then, just when Amara thought the judge might explode in fury, he did something even more shocking. He stood up and walked out without another word. He disappeared into his chambers, slamming the door behind him. Silence hung in the air, so thick it was almost suffocating. Claire turned to Angela, who let out a breath and shook her head. "Well," Angela muttered, "that was easier than I expected." Amara, still stunned, managed to whisper, "What happens now?" Claire smiled slightly, but there was a fire in her eyes. "Now, we take down the entire system that let him get away with this for so long." The real fight was only beginning. The courtroom remained in stunned silence for several moments after Judge Harrington stormed out. The whispers began almost immediately, hushed voices speculating about what had just happened. No one had ever seen a judge abandon his own bench in the middle of a case. Amara felt her breath catch in her throat. Was this it? Had they finally cracked the foundation of the corrupt system that had been stacked against her from the very beginning? Claire wasted no time. She turned to the jury and the spectators, her voice clear and firm. "Your Honor's reaction speaks volumes. When confronted with the truth, he ran. And that is because he knew what we all just saw. This case was never about justice. It was about control." The prosecutor, an older man named District Attorney Paul Whitman, stood abruptly. "This is highly inappropriate. Judge Harrington will return, and this trial will resume as it should." But Detective Angela Monroe wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and tapped on the screen. "Actually, that's going to be a problem for him. I just got word that federal investigators have been notified. Judge Harrington has been under quiet investigation for months, and this case just gave them the final push they needed. He won't be back on that bench anytime soon." Gasps spread through the courtroom. Amara's mind reeled. This wasn't just a battle for her own freedom anymore. This was a reckoning. The judge was gone, but the case wasn't over yet. The trial had continued, and now it was in freefall. The courtroom clerk, looking unsure, stood and announced that the Chief Justice of the District Court had been contacted to send a replacement judge. But Amara could see it in the faces around her. The case had already shifted in ways no one could have predicted. Hours passed as the courthouse scrambled to contain the chaos. Reporters were already gathering outside, their cameras waiting to capture the downfall of a man who had sat on the bench for decades with unchecked power. Then came the next blow. A court official walked in, whispering something into the prosecutor's ear. His face darkened, his grip tightening on the documents in front of him. He turned toward Claire and Amara, his lips pressed into a thin line. "The state has decided to dismiss all charges," he announced stiffly. Amara blinked. Did she hear that right? Claire's eyes narrowed. "You're dropping the case?" The prosecutor exhaled sharply, as if the words burned his throat. "Given recent developments, we cannot proceed in good faith." Angela smirked from her seat in the back of the courtroom. "Translation, you know this case was built on lies, and now that Harrington isn't here protected, you don't want the public scrutiny." The prosecutor didn't respond. He simply packed his briefcase and walked out. Claire turned to Amara, gripping her hands. "It's over." A wave of relief crashed over her, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "I'm free?" Claire nodded. "You're free." Amara had dreamed of this moment, but in the end, it felt almost surreal. No dramatic final argument, no jury deliberation, just a weight of corruption caving in on itself under its own rot. The bailiff called for the court to be dismissed. Amara stood slowly, her legs weak, her body still tense, as if waiting for someone to tell her it was all a cruel joke. But as she turned toward the gallery, she saw the faces of those who believed in her, Angela, Claire, and even some of the jurors who had suspected something wasn't right all along. She was finally free, but there was still one more battle to fight. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Questions were shouted from every direction. Amara, How do you feel about the case being dropped? What do you have to say about Judge Harrington's alleged corruption? What will you do next? Amara took a deep breath and looked at Claire. They had fought so hard to get here. But this wasn't just about her anymore. She turned to the cameras, her voice strong despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. I'm grateful to be free, but this is bigger than me. How many others were trapped under Judge Harrington's rulings? How many lives were destroyed by the system that protected him? Murmurs spread through the crowd. Angela stepped forward, adding, investigations into Judge Harrington's history are already underway. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that these kinds of men don't operate alone. This is just the beginning. Amara looked at the sea of cameras, the weight of what she had been through settling in her chest. The judge had thought he could get away with it, but now the world was watching, and justice was far from over. The world didn't stop after the trial ended. If anything, it moved faster. The news of Judge Harrington's abrupt exit from the courtroom spread like wildfire. Within hours, his name was plastered across every major news outlet. Headlines screamed of corruption, abuse of power, and racial bias in the judicial system. Amara's face was everywhere. Her story a symbol of resilience, but also a painful reminder of how many others had suffered in silence. She was free, but the fight wasn't over. 2 days after the trial collapsed, Amara sat in Claire's office, watching the television screen in stunned silence. The words running across the bottom of the broadcast sent chills down her spine. Breaking. Judge Harrington arrested on charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. A shaky video played, a cell phone recording of federal agents escorting Harrington out of his lavish home in handcuffs. His once imposing presence was now replaced by the slumped posture of a man whose world had crumbled. Angela, seated next to Amara, smirked. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Claire, standing with her arms crossed, exhaled. They found financial records linking him to bribes from law enforcement officials, including Officer Thomas. Amara's stomach churned. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of anger through her. How deep does this go? Angela turned serious. Deep enough. It's not just him. Other judges, police officers, even lawyers. There's a whole network of people being looked into now. Amara clenched her fists. For so long, she had thought of her case as an isolated injustice. But the truth was far worse. Harrington wasn't just a single corrupt judge. He was part of a system that had thrived on suppressing people like her. And now, that system was finally cracking. The following week, protests erupted in front of courthouse. People held signs demanding reform, calling for accountability, and chanting Amara's name alongside those of others who had been wrongfully convicted under Harrington's rulings. Amara hadn't planned on speaking, but as she stood among the crowd, hearing the voices rise together, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Stepping onto a makeshift stage, she took the microphone, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked out at the faces before her, black, white, young, old, all of them united by the same desire, justice. She took a deep breath. I was lucky. I had people fighting for me. But how many others never got that chance? How many people were buried under this corrupt system with no one to hear their cries? The crowd responded with shouts of agreement. Amara tightened her grip on the mic. This isn't just about one bad judge. It's about an entire system that allowed him to thrive. And we can't stop until every person who is wrong gets the justice they deserve. Cheers erupted. Angela leaned over and whispered, "You just started a movement." Amara swallowed hard. She hadn't set out to be an activist. She had just wanted to survive. But maybe survival wasn't enough. Maybe fighting back, loudly, unapologetically, was the only way forward. A month later, Amara found herself walking down a sterile hallway, the heavy doors of Federal Detention Center looming ahead. The guard led her into a small, gray-walled meeting room. Judge Harrington, or what was left of him, sat on the other side of the glass. His once pristine suit was replaced with an orange jumpsuit. His hair, once carefully styled, was now unkempt. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by something hollow. When he finally looked up at her, His eyes were filled with something she had never seen before. Fear. For so long, he had been the one in control, but now he was the one trapped. Amara picked up the phone receiver, meeting his gaze with unwavering strength. You thought you could get away with it. He didn't respond. She tilted her head. How many people begged you for mercy? How many lives did you ruin while sitting in that chair, believing you were untouchable? His lips parted, but no words came out. She leaned forward slightly. I want you to remember this moment, Harrington. I want you to remember what it feels like to be powerless. His fingers twitched against the table, his jaw clenching, but he had no defense, no authority, no escape, just silence. Amara stood, setting the receiver down. You don't deserve my forgiveness, but you will remember me. And with that, she walked away. 6 months later, Amara stood in front of a podium, preparing to address a room filled with law students and activists. So many people told me I'd never get justice, she said, that the system was too powerful, too unshakable. But change doesn't happen overnight. It happens because people refuse to be silent, because we demand it. Applause filled the room. She smiled. The weight of her past no longer a chain around her neck, but a fire in her heart. She had survived. And now, she was going to make sure no one else had to fight alone. The racist judge had fallen, but the fight for justice had only just begun.